Welcome back to Stories from the Stead with your host, the alchemist of Indiana's Black Forest, Alan Bishop. So last week we got into the tragic, sad story of Bailey Bowling, which is sort of a bookend in many ways to the era of distillation here in the Black Forest of southern Indiana. Prohibition really brought an end to a lot of those things, and culturally things never were the same after that in this region. It's only now that we're starting to come back around to some of those sort of things in terms of what our history and our heritage is. But not all that history and heritage is pretty. Not all of it's nice. Some of it's pretty violent. This story in particular is a good example of it. This happened before Prohibition, but there are still, at that time, illicit distillers, particularly in Crawford County, Indiana, which is actually where the Stead is, Old Homestead Distillery, where I'm the head alchemist. This story is going to have some words in it that you might not be familiar with, or a word in it that you might not be familiar with. That word is whitecap. Now, that word does not necessarily mean a member of a particularly racist gang that wore white pointy caps. It could be a lot of different things. It, in particular, could be a vigilance committee, much like the Jackson County Vigilance Committee, a posse of sorts who would go in and, oftentimes somebody was arrested for murder. They would break into the jail, take that person out of the jail, extract vengeance, folk style, right? Now, there's some pretty nasty things that happen in this story. So I can't say one way, shape, form, or the other what organization these men were affiliated with. What I can tell you is the story revolves around a stolen 90-gallon copper pot still, but there were as many as 40 men in this posse, and there's no way that 40 men were making enough money off a 90-gallon pot still to make that worthwhile. So something bigger was certainly happening in Crawford County at that time. I found this story originally in the Daily Evening Republican from Saturday, May the 29th of 1880. And then I did some more research into it, and I came up with the best details and the best outline of what happened that I possibly could. I really hope you enjoy it and continue to tune in for these stories from the Stead, because it's my responsibility as a storyteller and as the alchemist of the Black Forest to tell these stories so that we remember our history. Sometimes so that it doesn't repeat itself, and sometimes so we can bring glory back to the way that things had been in certain areas of life at that time. So, in 1878, a 90-gallon still was stolen from John Heinrich Distillery in Marengo, Indiana, Crawford County. It wasn't long after that it became apparent to officers that the still never actually left the county, as the illicit spirit hit the local market and became extremely popular. With eastern Crawford County being covered in forests, ravines, and rocky outcrops, it wasn't hard for the moonshiners to ply their trade in secret. The sparsely populated and old-growth hills provided excellent cover for the illicit operation. In 1879, revenue officers T.A. Lyons and William Yates tracked down the operation in a ravine near the mouth of Wyandotte Cave. But the moonshiners employed a spotter and saw the men coming, making good on their escape and taking the 90-gallon still with them. They also burned their shanty on the way out to destroy any evidence against them. Since that time, the gang's illicit trade has flourished locally. The gang so well organized that no one could ever even get close to them. The second an officer would arrive in Crawford County, he was watched and followed closely by the gang members, and his process of investigation was signaled from place to place by hidden means. Reliable local witnesses, however, continued to report information to the authorities regarding the location of the still, and evidence against several stacked up until they were placed under indictment with the belief that there was an excellent chance of their conviction. Statements from witnesses verified not only did the gang watch officers closely, but they also took every opportunity to retaliate with great vengeance and violence against any person that they suspected of giving evidence and information against them. For example, on the night of April the 7th, 40 of the desperados visited the home of William Saltzgaven, who they believe had given evidence. They broke open the doors with heavy rails, tied a rope around his feet, and drug him from his home across a rocky creek to a tree, to which they tied him and whipped him viciously with hickory switches. To this embarrassment, they degraded his wife and daughter. Afterwards, they dragged him over the jagged rocks of the creek and back home. where they took a quantity of axle grease, no tar being available to them at the time, smeared it over his head and face, and stuck his head in a feather bed that they had ripped open. The Whiskey Rebellion sort of lived on even here in Indiana, as it turns out. As it turns out, this man had never even turned evidence against the gang. They took another man from his bed, tied a cord to him, and drug him down a gravel road. He never really entirely recovered from his wounds. The members indicted are James McLean, William Dean, Frank Campbell, Welcome Huff, Oliver Scott, and James Lynch. Mr. Adams and colleagues came via Louisville to Leavenworth last Tuesday on a steamship and delivered a warrant to Frank Campbell at his saloon. The marshals immediately arrested Campbell to prevent him from notifying the rest of the gang. Horses were readied, and 3 local guides were hired to take the men into the hills of Crawford County. The men divided into 3 parties and set out into the countryside, where each of the indicted men were captured at home in their beds and bonded for $1,000 each. As a curious incident, stolen copper still from Heinrich Distillery 2 years ago was returned to him in the same mysterious fashion as it had disappeared, making one wonder who was really involved in this illicit moonshine ring. Often, you want to find corruption, look at the obvious sources. So Crawford County is an interesting place in terms of the Black Forest of Southern Indiana, because on the eastern side of Crawford County, you're not going to find any real legal distilleries, even throughout the 1800s. If so, it's going to be maybe 1 or 2 at the most, and only going to be seasonal and for very short periods of years. You will find one at Marengo, you will find one at English, but other than that, there's not much there between the eastern side of Crawford County and coming back into Orange County. Now, there are springs everywhere, and I have tons of stories about moonshining around the area that is now known as Patoka Lake, and then obviously French Lick as well. The big distilleries were on the river at Magnolia and at Leavenworth. There was one large one at Magnolia and 2 at Leavenworth, mostly making apple brandy. But this certainly wasn't stopping any of the locals from producing the famous drinks that were made here in southern Indiana, as you can tell from this story. And it would seem that there's much more to this story. Again, a 90-gallon still is not going to support a gang of 40 men. There's no way. So there's far more going on with this story in particular. And in many ways, it doesn't surprise me because it echoes many of the other stories I have of the Black Forest. I'm going to continue to dive into Crawford County, and I'm going to bring you as many of those stories as what I possibly can, including the story of a legal distiller who went off the record in January one year in the 1800s, telling the gaugers that he was out of the business, and began to operate his distillery late in the evening, making an illicit product made specifically of corn and sorghum molasses. Hope you enjoyed the story, guys. Catch you later.